Hello, everyone. Warmest welcomes to Holy Comforter Episcopal Church for episode 7 of our Adult Christian Formation series for fall 2020 called Liturgy, the Work of the People. In this series, we are taking a step back and looking at the liturgy and the worship of the Episcopal Church, especially during this time of social distancing, because I think that this is giving us some good insight into why we do the things that we do. Just a reminder that we have another discussion section via Zoom next Sunday, October 11th at 10 a.m. Please check your weekly blast for those links, or you can go to holycomforterspring.org/events and find all of the links there. If you are looking for some additional resources, I'd encourage you to pick up the book Liturgy for Living, as well as the book Praying Shapes Believing, a theological commentary on the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. Remember that our entire series is focused on this question: why do Episcopalians do what we do when we gather on Sundays and other special days of the year in the presence of God? Now, what we're doing from last session and this session is that focusing on that word gather. Why do Episcopalians do what we do when we gather? Because gathering connotes a shared space, that we will be coming together to gather in some sort of physical presence to do the things that we do on Sundays and the other special days of the year. So we talked about space last time. We talked about sacred space. We talked about some of the traditional spaces. We talked about some of the scriptural references to sacred space. Today, we're going to be talking about some other times that Christians have not gathered together in spaces. I think part of what's going on in 2020 is that we think to ourselves, let me go to that slide and we'll go back to the other one, that we think to ourselves in 2020, this is so strange. This is the first time Christians have not gathered in person for forever. Well, it's just not true. There have been many times throughout Christian history when Christians have not gathered as a body for worship because of various things going on in the life of the world. Of course, gathering is so important for us as Episcopalians, as Anglicans, because we do have this rich incarnational sense of our worship. Incarnation as in God made flesh. That's why we have Christmas, right? We also have the sense of sacraments. Remember, sacraments are outward and visible signs of inward and spiritual grace. Well, the only way to get that outward and visible sign is to be together. Think of the Holy Communion, to eat, to drink, or Holy Baptism, to immerse with water. Those are all those reasons that we as Episcopalians, as Anglicans, gather in person for all of our worship. And I think that has made what's made this year so difficult. This picture here is my pulpit, was my pulpit for much of the summer, my little setup. We had a computer system to where I could run the church service right there from my laptop, and I was able to pull in folks who had read the Psalms or read the lessons from their own homes, and then was able to stream that all out. One of the things that we were able to do with this is that though we were not gathered together in the same space, we were gathered together at the same time, because the majority of our services were not pre-recorded. And I think that was important, that though we couldn't all be together in that space, we could still be together in that time. We're also talking about space, and I talked about this last week, because Holy Comforter has had lots of worship spaces. In the bottom right there, you see the little white church building. The upper right is the old church, the church that I knew and came into in 2012. And of course, there is the new church there. Now, there have been times in the past when Christians have not gathered together. Episcopalians and Anglicans have refrained from in-person worship. See the big picture on your left? That is one of those famous pictures from the 1918 flu pandemic. It's really interesting going back and reading church registers, like the service records from those old churches. They refrained from worship during the 1918 pandemic. So this is just kind of part of what we do when there are pandemics like this that are passed from person to person. We decide that it's best to not gather. Though we think and believe that gathering together in person is good and righteous and holy, it's also one of those times that we have to weigh just the common good and public health. It also happened throughout the 19th century in the various yellow fever epidemics that swept across the United States. You know, my friend who is the rector of St. James Episcopal Church in LaGrange, Texas, says that he went back and looked, and half his congregation died in the 1860s from yellow fever. So this is something that we as Episcopalians in the Diocese of Texas even are very used to. If you look in the upper right, that is a picture of St. John's Episcopal Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, if you remember your United States history, in your Civil War history, St. John's was where the Confederate Episcopal Church was established. All the Southern bishops gathered together in the nave of St. John's and created the Confederate Episcopal Church. You can imagine then that after the war, when the Union troops came to Montgomery, they came across St. John's and they said, "You're not going to church," because they saw it as a seat of dissent, a hotbed of traitors, if you will. So you can imagine that the Union troops were not too keen on letting folks back into St. John's Montgomery, and so worship there was actually suspended for months, and folks had to worship in their homes if they wanted to worship, because the Union troops were not allowing them into their sacred space. And then there's a little note that I wrote. You can see my bad handwriting. COVID-19 pandemic forces suspension of in-person worship. That's what I wrote in our parish register at Holy Comforter. And you know, as I was writing that, I was thinking there's going to be some priest, my predecessor and their predecessor, successor, my successor, and then their successor, and the successor after that, who's going to go back and read that. And I know that they're going to look at this time and see what I wrote and see what I said. And so I tried to be just as even-keeled as I could. And of course, we've been making notes about our online services and now for our in-person services as well. But I took writing that with knowing that someone was going to read that and be curious. And personally speaking, as a historian, I always know that's important. I also want to talk some about other sacred spaces. I think part of what this pandemic has done is that we are now reclaiming the home as the primary place of Christian worship, as it was for the first 2 centuries of Christianity. If you remember last week, we looked at the ruins of that Dura Europos church. If you remember, that church wasn't started until the middle of the 3rd century AD. So that means for the first 250 years, 200 years of the church, the primary place of Christian worship was the home. And I think we're reclaiming that, and now we're seeing that the church is a place of public worship, but the home is really the place where discipleship takes place. Here is the Abbott Family Sacred Space that we put up for Holy Week and Easter. You can see some icons that are important to us. That is a cross that our daughter drew. There was a bowl of water to remind us of baptism. All of these things were meaningful to us, and this sacred space became the axis, if you will, around which we prayed for Holy Week and for Easter. I also have a thought about this, that when I was a little boy, my father was a Dodgers fan, and I became a Dodgers fan. Not because he drove me to some building and dropped me off for 1 hour a week where they taught me how to be a Dodgers fan. No, it was because we talked about the Dodgers. We watched the ball games. We'd read the box scores in the morning. That is how I became a baseball fan and a Dodgers fan. In the same way, I think that's really how the church it has to operate. That the real place of Christian worship and discipleship and practice takes place in the home, and that we are to do that with our families. If we live in families, we are to do that with ourselves if we live alone. But that's the real place where we grow in our faith. And we go to the church for public celebrations and public prayer and worship. So I think partially in a way, this pandemic is helping us reclaim that model in which true Christian discipleship, true Christian devotion is primarily taking place at home, and the church, if you will, just becomes the sort of booster for the rest of the week. I want you to think about that in your own life. What are the ways that your parents maybe, or your family, or your friends at home have raised you up in the Christian faith? And then how is it that you're seeing church as more of the booster rather than as the only place of prayer? Of course, there are other sacred spaces that we should think about. Of course, churches and homes are not the only sacred spaces. Camps are a place of spiritual renewal. Here's a picture of the outdoor chapel at Camp Allen. Oftentimes, confirmations will take place during camp or baptisms. I think that's really, really powerful stuff. It's important, though, is that, say, Camp Allen, as much as it is beloved, it is not a place of normal Christian worship. It is not where we go for our daily or weekly Christian worship. It is a place to which we go for renewal, for rejuvenation, for retreat, maybe for rest. But it's important, I think, especially for our youth that go to Camp Allen, that it is not the only place for Christian renewal. I always talk about this with kids, say, after the coming back from happening, is that you have been on the spiritual mountaintop. Camp Allen is this beautiful place. You feel surrounded with love and grace and people who are praying with you. It can be really hard to come back down and then just go back to normal church. I think we just always have to keep in mind that some of these other sacred spaces, though they are good, are never intended to take the place of normal Christian worship that takes place in the home and then secondarily in the church. There are other places of great holiness. I think about some shrines. Thomas Becket, the Altar of Martyrdom within Canterbury Cathedral. The Shrine of Edward the Confessor at Westminster Abbey. Again, these are places to go to, but they're not places that you stay. Right? Especially for a place of pilgrimage, I think the whole point of the pilgrimage is the going. And once you get there, yes, there is great joy, there's rejoicing, there's spiritual refreshment and reawakening. But eventually you got to go home again. You can't stay at the shrine. You can't always be on a pilgrimage from just one holy place to another. So again, to think of these sacred spaces as places for rejuvenation rather than for the normal meat and potatoes, daily and weekly Christian practices. My question for reflection today, when we think about our sacred spaces, is why do you miss church? Why do you miss church? Of course, I'm making an assumption here that you do miss church. I mean, I think if you're actually watching this and if you made it through 7 weeks of this series, you probably do miss it in some way. So that's what I'd like for you to journal about. Why do you miss the sacred space? Because, as I said, you ought to be praying and doing your acts of piety and devotion at home as the primary place. So why do you miss actually gathering together in our sacred space weekly for public celebrations? Thank you so much for joining me. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, your comments. You can always email me, jimmy@holycomforterspring.org. You can always leave a comment here in the YouTube section. And as I said at the beginning, we will have our next discussion group on Sunday, October 11th at 10 a.m. via Zoom. Thank you all so much for joining me.